The nurse noticed it was wrong before she noticed it was old. The oxygen mask in his grip didn't have the usual plastic tubing that branched into their standard configurations. This mask was different, heavier somehow, with a metal frame that had been polished smooth by decades of hands. But that's not what made her stop. It was the way he held it. Like it was a living thing, like if he let go even for a second, something would disappear that he couldn't get back. His name was in the admission paperwork as a retired Air Force pilot, and the word retired sat there on the form like it was enough context. 78 years old, declining health, daughter visiting every afternoon at 3 o'clock exactly. The paperwork said pneumonia, said his oxygen levels were dropping, said he needed observation. The paperwork didn't mention the mask. The nurse, whose name was Diane, and who'd worked in critical care for 15 years before transferring to the regular ward because she wanted time with her own family while she still had it, had learned to trust the details that didn't make sense. That was her gift. While other people saw a sick old man with anxiety, she saw a sick old man with a reason. The mask was the reason. You didn't hold something like that unless it meant something. You didn't grip it with your dominant hand while your other hand trembled from fever unless you'd been taught that some things mattered more than comfort. She'd seen her own father do something similar once, years after his Navy discharge. He'd kept a photograph of his ship in his wallet until the photograph was worn soft and the creases were almost through lines. When Diane had asked him why he carried it, why he didn't frame it or put it somewhere safe, he'd looked at her like she'd asked why he had to keep breathing. Some things, he'd said, were closer to you when they were falling apart in your pocket. This pilot's oxygen mask was falling apart. Not literally, the construction was surprisingly sound, the seal still tight, but in the way that time breaks things. The rubber had yellowed. The metal had developed a patina. There was a small dent on one side that looked deliberate, like maybe he'd rested it against something specific enough times that it had worn that way. The hospital room's fluorescent lights caught the edge of the metal frame, and Diane could see the scratches and minor corrosions that marked decades of handling. Someone had loved this object into its current state of deterioration. The first attempt at conversation came at 7 in the morning when Diane was doing the initial vitals. The monitor beside the bed showed his oxygen saturation at 89%. Low, concerning. His blood pressure was elevated. His pulse was irregular, skipping like a scratched record. When Diane asked him if she could examine the mask just to establish a baseline, just to understand the fit and make sure it wasn't interfering with his breathing, he said no. He didn't say it firmly or aggressively. He said it the way you'd say no to someone offering to take your coat when you were already cold. Final, polite, non-negotiable. "It's providing adequate seal," Diane said gently, reading the data from her equipment. "But I want to make sure we're optimizing your oxygen intake. May I take a quick look at the fit around your nose and mouth?" "No," he said again. The same tone, but this time she heard something else beneath it. Not fear, exactly. Something older than fear. Something that had been there so long it had become a part of his breathing. Diane didn't push. That was another thing she'd learned in 15 years of critical care. Pushing at the wrong moment closes doors that take months to reopen. Instead, she made a note in his chart. Patient refuses mask examination. Holding object with unusual intensity. Investigate further. And she moved on to check his IV, to adjust his pillows, to do the mechanical work of nursing while her mind worked on the puzzle. It wasn't until later that morning, around 10:30, when Dr. Morrison came in for rounds, that the situation escalated. Morrison was the kind of doctor who had been practicing since before Diane was born. He had that particular confidence that comes from 40 years of being right, or at least from successfully defending the times he was wrong. He looked at the oxygen mask for approximately 3 seconds before reaching out to take it. "Let's get this off and get you on proper hospital equipment," Morrison said. It wasn't a question. The reaction was immediate. Rick's hand closed around the mask so tightly that his already pale fingers turned completely white. His breathing accelerated. The monitor beside the bed started alarming. Oxygen saturation dropping, heart rate climbing. "Sir, I understand you want to keep your own mask, but we need to ensure—" Morrison began. "You don't understand anything," Rick said. His voice was sharp, brittle. Not like an elderly man with pneumonia. Like someone accessing a part of himself that had been sealed away. "This mask stays with me. That's not negotiable." Diane moved between them with a smoothness born of practice. "Dr. Morrison, may I speak with you for a moment?" She guided him out of the room, her hand barely touching his elbow, her voice completely calm. His vitals spike when we approach the mask. "I think there's a psychological component we need to account for. If we force the issue, we risk an acute stress response that could compromise his oxygen saturation further." Morrison's expression suggested that psychological components were something you acknowledged in literature, not in actual medicine. But he was old enough to know when he was being managed by someone smarter than he was in that particular domain. "Keep it for now," he said. "But if his oxygen levels drop below 85, we're removing it. Protocol." When Diane went back into the room, "Rick was watching the well," Diane said. "And she meant it." "She well?" Diane said. And she meant it. She pulled a chair close to the bed, because that's what you do when you're going to have a real conversation instead of a procedural one. "I'm not here to take it from you. I just want to understand. Help me understand why this particular mask matters so much." He turned his head toward her slowly. His eyes were watery from the fever, but they were sharp. Military eyes, the kind that assessed before they committed. Eyes that had looked at the horizon from 30,000 feet and made decisions that other people didn't have to make. "You'll think it's strange," he said. "I work in a hospital," Diane said. "The definition of strange gets pretty flexible. Last week I had a patient who insisted on sleeping in his shoes. The week before, someone who would only drink water if it was been poured by his daughter. Strange is relative." That almost made him smile. Almost. The corner of his mouth twitched, and then whatever muscle had started to move gave up. He looked down at the mask in his hands, his fingers uncurled just slightly, and Diane watched the progression of his internal debate play out in real time. "How long have you been a nurse?" he asked. 31 years in total," Diane said. 15 of those in critical care, and 6 before that in a cardiac ICU. Before that, I worked in emergency medicine for 10 years. You've seen people at their worst. I've seen people at their most vulnerable," Diane corrected gently, "which isn't the same as their worst." He held the mask between them for a long moment, and she could see his reluctance in every angle of his body. But he held it toward her, extending it like he was passing off a weight he'd been carrying too long. This was when Diane knew. This was the moment she recognized that something fundamental was happening. The moment she looked inside the mask's interior chambers, she saw it immediately. A small metal object, dull with oxidation, secured with what looked like old medical tape wrapped around the frame. It was small enough that you'd only see it if you were actually looking inside. If you knew to look past the obvious function of the thing. Her hands moved instinctively into examination mode, fingers in surgical gloves, careful and precise. She didn't touch the metal object. Something told her not to. But she could read the wear patterns, the history. The tape was original, military issue, the kind they'd used in the 70s. The metal underneath was oxidized but intact, and even through the corrosion, she could make out the shape. Dog tags. "What is it?" she asked, though she already knew. "Dog tags," he said quietly. "They're not yours." "No." Diane didn't ask the next question immediately. She knew that sometimes people needed you to wait for the answer rather than ask for it. She kept her eyes on the mask, on the object inside, giving him time to figure out if he wanted to explain or if he wanted to stop here. But the pilot didn't continue. He just looked at her, steady and tired and older than his years. And she made a decision that probably violated 3 different hospital protocols and one entire section of the hospital's chain of command. She called his daughter. The call lasted 7 minutes. Diane explained what she'd found without making assumptions about what it meant. She said his oxygen levels were stable. She said his blood pressure had spiked during rounds with Dr. Morrison. She said there was something in the mask that seemed to be of significant emotional importance. Caroline's voice on the other end shifted. It went from the worried daughter register to something else. Something like recognition. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, Caroline said. "I'm leaving work right now." Caroline's drive from her office downtown should have taken at least 45 minutes in afternoon traffic. She made it to the hospital in 32 minutes, which Diane verified by noting the time of the call and the time of Caroline's arrival. Whatever Caroline had done to shave off those minutes, speeding, weaving, prayers, all of the above. She'd done it with purpose. The daughter's name was Caroline, and when she entered the room, she didn't greet her father first, which told her father everything about what the nurse had seen. She looked at the nurse instead, and there was a specific kind of urgency in that look. The kind that says, "I know something is wrong, and I need to know what it is." "It's the mask," Diane said simply. "There's something inside it. Dog tags, I think. They're not his." Caroline turned to her father, and he could see the exact moment her expression changed from worry to understanding to something deeper. Something like sadness mixed with recognition. She pulled the visitor's chair closer, not with the gentle motion Diane had used, but with the abruptness of someone who suddenly needed to sit down before her legs decided they weren't supporting her anymore. "Dad," she said, who is that?" "Sit," he said. "Please, sit and I'll tell you. It's time." Caroline sat, and she held her father's hand, and the oxygen mask sat between them like a secret that had finally been given permission to speak. "So let me take you back. Let me show you the beginning of this, because you need to understand what 50 years of silence sounds like when it finally breaks open." The year was 1972. The location was a military installation in Southeast Asia that doesn't exist on maps you can find, or at least not with the designation it had then. The pilot, his name was Richard, though everyone called him Rick, was 27 years old and had been flying combat missions for 8 months. He was the kind of pilot who was excellent at his job because he understood it as a puzzle. The engine was one variable. The weather was another. The enemy was a problem to solve. You flew the aircraft, managed the systems, made decisions at 300 miles per hour. And when you came back, you tried to explain the experience to people who'd never accelerated hard enough to feel their organs shift in their body. My brother told me about this once, about what it feels like to make decisions at speed. He said it was like your entire nervous system was accelerated, like you were operating on a time scale that made normal life feel like moving through water. You could compress an hour's worth of thinking into minutes. You learned to trust instincts that normally would take years to develop. You learned that hesitation could kill you, but so could action. So you learned to make the call and live with it. Rick had completed 63 missions without incident. That's a number that mattered in that war. Not all pilots reached 60. Some didn't reach 30. The mechanics and the ground crew kept their bets quiet about which flyers would make it. And they kept their faces neutral when someone didn't come back. Neutral was a survival mechanism. Hope was a liability. Rick's wingman was a guy named Paul. They'd trained together, processed their assignments together, and flown together for 4 months. In a war, that's a significant relationship. You trust someone with your life in a way that civilians don't understand. My brother served 2 tours in combat, and he told me that the person you're flying with, or fighting beside, or moving under fire with, becomes essential to you in a way that's biological. Your brain doesn't distinguish between that person and your own survival mechanisms. If they're threatened, you feel it as your own threat. You don't have to think about saving them. Your body just does it. You'd eject into enemy territory for them. You'd disobey direct orders for them. You'd carry a piece of them for 50 years without anyone asking you to, without anyone even knowing you'd done it. Paul was supposed to fly the next morning. The briefing was at 4:30 a.m. Rick remembered this because it was the kind of detail that stuck. The pre-dawn darkness, the way the fluorescent lights made everyone look sallow, the sound of the weather officer explaining wind patterns and cloud cover, the way the base itself felt different at that hour, like everyone was operating on half sleep and muscle memory. But Paul didn't make it to the briefing. A runner came through the ready room before 4:15 and asked if anyone knew Paul Hendricks. That question alone was enough to bring everything to a stop. No one asked that question unless something was wrong. Paul had collapsed in his quarters the night before with a severe fever. The medical officer, a young guy named Vasquez, who couldn't have been more than 25, had ordered him to hospital. Pneumonia, severe respiratory infection. They wouldn't know which until they'd run more tests, but the symptoms were clear enough. The same diagnosis they'd give Rick 56 years later. Diane made a note about this in her chart. Patient was exposed to similar illness in 1972. Emotional trauma from that period may be complicating current respiratory crisis. Monitor for signs of PTSD or acute stress response. Rick was reassigned a different wingman for the mission. A good pilot. Competent. Rick had flown with him before. Everything was fine. Everything should have been fine. That was what everyone said afterward. That was what was in all the official paperwork. Everything should have been fine. The problem wasn't the new wingman. The problem was the unexpected enemy engagement. They weren't supposed to encounter any opposition on that route. The intelligence said the sector was clear. The intelligence was wrong. It was wrong the way that intelligence often is in situations that are impossible to predict. Something had shifted since the morning briefing. Different patrols, different deployments, different decisions made by people you'd never meet in rooms you'd never see. Decisions that cascaded down into the sky and caught 2 aircraft and changed the trajectory of one man's entire life. Rick's wingman was hit almost immediately. An RPG caught his aircraft on the fuselage, and systems started cascading into failure. Rick watched his instruments light up with warnings from the other plane. He watched the aircraft begin to lose altitude. He watched his wingman attempt 3 times to eject, and something was jammed. The systems weren't responding. The ejection mechanism was damaged or stuck or mechanically refused. Rick stayed in formation with him, trying to stay close to the point of ejection, trying to be the first person there if he made it out, trying not to think about what would happen if he didn't. He saw the canopy open. He saw the pilot's form struggling against the deceleration. He saw everything. These are the things that stick. These are the things that don't fade. Even 56 years later, when you're lying in a hospital bed with pneumonia and a grip so tight on a worn oxygen mask that someone has to call your daughter. His wingman's name was James. Rick had had breakfast with him 12 hours earlier. They'd sat in the mess hall and talked about their families. James had a picture of his son, 3 years old, born while he was on deployment. He'd shown it to Rick like it was the most precious thing in the world, which it was. The kid had James's eyes. James had been so proud of that his eyes were continuing on into the world, that there was this small evidence that he'd existed, that he mattered, that something of him would keep going, even if this war killed him. Rick had thought, sitting in that mess hall with the sound of helicopters in the distance, and the smell of institutional food, and 50 other pilots trying not to think about whether they'd be coming back from the next day's missions. This is what it means to be alive. To know that someone depends on you. To want to get home to them. To be terrified that you won't. That balance between fear and hope. That's the most honest thing humans feel. Rick ejected. His aircraft was damaged too by this point. Systems failing, and there was no strategic reason to stay in the sky. He descended on his parachute, and he could see James's parachute too. And he knew where James was going to land. He knew he couldn't get to him. He knew the enemy knew where they were too. Those were the facts. Those were the certainties. Everything else was just time passing in a way that felt too slow and too fast simultaneously. The rescue came in 17 minutes. That's a long time when you're on the ground with enemy patrols searching for you. The helicopter crew extracted him, and he asked immediately about James. He wasn't thinking clearly. His flight suit was torn, his arm was bleeding from shrapnel, his ears were ringing from the ejection. But the only thing that mattered was, what about James? The pilot of the rescue helicopter, a guy named Marcus, said, "We've got another bird going in." That meant they were sending a second helicopter. That meant they weren't giving up on James. That meant there was hope. Rick clung to that hope for 17 more minutes, while the extraction helicopter rose into the air and the sound of small arms fire pinged off the fuselage. But they didn't get in time. The second extraction helicopter made it to the landing zone and found the parachute, but not James. James had been captured before the second bird could reach him. The military would confirm it eventually through intelligence reports and prisoner processing. James Mitchell, 1st Lieutenant, USAF, shot down September 14th, 1972. Captured by enemy forces. Status: presumed alive. Location: unknown. Rick was invalided out of theater 3 days later due to dehydration and acute stress response. That's the clinical term. What it meant was that he couldn't fly anymore. Not right then. His hands were shaking too badly, and the military doctors decided he needed to go home. They gave him a desk job for the last 6 months of his tour, processing paperwork, which was its own kind of torture because it meant he spent every day in the flight operations office, surrounded by the names of people, seeing the aircraft coming and going, counting the ones that didn't come back. Before he left the base for stateside reassignment, he went to the hospital to see Paul. Paul had recovered from the pneumonia, was being cleared to return to flight status. They'd gotten him antibiotics early enough. His lungs had cleared. His fever had broken. He was going to be fine. He was going to go back to flying. Rick sat on the edge of Paul's bed and told him what happened. Not the classified details, just the human details. Just that James didn't come back. just that the extraction was seconds too late. Just that somewhere out there, James's 3-year-old son was growing up without knowing what happened to his father, without knowing anything except that he was gone. Paul didn't say anything for a long time. The hospital room around them was standard military hospital. Institutional green walls, the steady beep of monitors, the smell of antiseptic and something organic underneath it that you never quite got used to. Outside, the base continued its operations. Its aircraft took off. The war continued. People prepared for missions that some of them wouldn't come back from. Then Paul asked, "Is his son going to know about him?" Rick didn't know how to answer that. He didn't know anything about rescue or recovery or what happened to pilots in enemy hands. He didn't know if James was alive. He didn't know if he was coming home. He didn't know if anyone would ever tell James's son who his father really was. Not just that he was military, not just that he served, but that he was an excellent pilot and a kind person and someone who carried a picture of his kid and showed it to people like it was the most important thing in the world. What Rick did know was that he couldn't live with uncertainty. He couldn't live with the idea that James's son would grow up without knowing that his father had mattered. So before he left the base for the final time, he was given a final salute, a final wave, a final goodbye. So before he left the base for the final time, he did something that would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone had caught him. He didn't think about it. He just did it, the same way you move your hand away from a hot surface without making a conscious decision to move. Instinct. Infrastructure. He went to the flight operations office, and he found James's records in the holding files, his personal effects that were being held pending next of kin notification. And he found James's oxygen mask, the one from his aircraft, the one he'd been wearing when he ejected. It was stowed carefully in a protective container, waiting to be sent home with an explanatory letter and a folded flag. Rick took it. He didn't ask permission. He didn't fill out a form. He simply took the mask because it was real, and it was tangible, and it was something, and if nothing else could be done, at least something connected to James could reach his family. At least there was that. At least his name wouldn't disappear completely. At least someone would know. He spent the next 6 months hiding that mask in his quarters, wrapped in cloth inside his footlocker under his service records. When he was reassigned to stateside training, he smuggled it through base security in his duffel bag, tucked under his dress uniform. When he completed his service obligations and returned to civilian life, he kept the mask. He brought it to his small apartment. He kept it wrapped in cloth in a box at the back of his bedroom closet. Why? Why keep something that represented his greatest failure? Why hold on to a mask that belonged to a man he'd failed to save? Why carry the weight of that promise for 56 years? Because, as Rick would eventually tell Diane and his daughter Caroline while she held his hand and tears moved down his weathered face, some things are too important to let go of. Some things are the only way you have to say to the people you love. This person mattered. This person was real. This person is not forgotten. This person's life meant something. Their existence wasn't erased. I was here. I knew them. I remember. Rick had never had contact with James's family. He'd looked for them once, in 1978, driving to an address from old military records, only to find a different family living in the house. He'd tried again in 1995, in the early days of the internet. But the records were fragmented and his searches didn't turn up results. Each time he failed to find them, he felt the obligation more, not less. The mask became his way of keeping James in the world. It became the thing he held. It became his job to remember so that someone, someday, might understand that James Mitchell had lived, had mattered, had loved his son, had been worth saving. Diane documented all of this in her chart as Carolyn spoke the story aloud, as she told the nurse who this was, and when it happened, and what it meant. Diane made notes about childhood trauma and coping mechanisms, and how the human mind creates rituals to survive the unsurvivable. But what she really documented was an act of love that had spanned 56 years. Now, let me tell you what happened next. Because the story doesn't end with a man holding an oxygen mask and a nurse making a phone call. The story continues. The story unfolds. The story insists on being heard. Caroline listened to her father's entire story without interrupting, though there were moments when she had to stop him and ask him to repeat details because her brain couldn't process what she was hearing. Her father, this man she'd visited every afternoon at 3 o'clock for the past week, this man she'd called her father for 54 years, had been carrying this burden for longer than she'd been alive, longer than her marriage, longer than her career. This secret had been in his pocket like a stone for her entire existence. Diane sat in the corner of the room, doing her job and being present. Because sometimes witnessing is the most important medical care you can provide. She was monitoring his oxygen saturation, his heart rate, his breathing. All of them were elevated. The story was costing him something. But his eyes were clearer than they'd been since admission. His grip on the mask had changed. It was still tight, but not desperate. Like he was finally passing the weight to someone else. And that made it possible to breathe. When Rick finished, Caroline asked, "Is it actually James's mask, the one he wore? Or is it symbolic?" "It's his," Rick said. "I kept it. I've kept it for all these years." "You never told us," Caroline said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, which is sometimes worse. Not Mom, not me, not your grandchildren. You carried this alone." "I didn't know how," Rick said. His voice cracked on the last word. Diane made another note. "Significant emotional breakthrough. Continue monitoring." How do you explain that you made a promise to someone that you could never keep? That you spent 50 years carrying something for a person you never found? How do you explain that to your family? That you've spent your whole life holding on to someone else's past? That the past matters more than... "It doesn't matter more than us," Caroline said firmly. She stood up and moved closer to the bed. "But I understand. I think I understand." She asked to see the mask. Rick held it out with the same careful reverence he'd shown Diane. Caroline opened it with the delicacy of someone handling a historical artifact, which in some way it was. The dog tags were still there, oxidized and worn and precious beyond measure. "His full name?" Caroline asked. "James Mitchell," Rick said. "First Lieutenant, USAF. Shot down September 14th, 1972. Caroline took out her phone, not to call anyone immediately, but to photograph the name on the tags. To document it, to make sure it wasn't lost again. This is where the story could have ended in a way that would be neat and resolved. This is where you might expect Caroline to find James Mitchell's family or his descendants and deliver the dog tags. And everyone would cry, and there would be closure and healing, and all the things that television tells you happen when you finally confront the truth. But real life is more complicated than narrative. Real life is messier and slower, and doesn't follow the 3-act structure that makes people feel satisfied. What Caroline discovered when she searched for James Mitchell's family was something that made her have to sit down again. She called Rick back from his hospital phone and told him, and watched his face process the information in real time. James Mitchell had come home. He had come home in 1973 as a prisoner of war. He'd survived in captivity for 9 months. Interrogations, isolation, Conditions that by any standard were designed to break a human being. But he'd survived it. He'd returned to the United States and to his wife and his son, the 3-year-old boy who was now 52 years old. James Mitchell had died in 2009. But his son was alive. He was alive, and he lived in a city 3 hours from where his father's mask had been sitting in Rick's bedroom closet, waiting to be found, waiting to be understood, and James's family had spent 50 years wondering about certain details of his service. They had combat records. They had medical records. They had the knowledge that he'd been shot down and captured. But a few details had always been unclear, always been difficult to obtain. The military records were fragmented or classified or simply lost. The government's memory was incomplete. The story was partial. They didn't have the oxygen mask. Nobody had ever mentioned an oxygen mask. Nobody had ever told them that someone had cared enough to take something belonging to James and carry it through 50 years of doubt and searching and terrible uncertainty. James's son was named Michael. He was a marine engineer, retired, lived in a modest house near the coast with his wife of 30 years. When Caroline called him and explained what her father had been carrying, Michael cried. He cried because someone had noticed his father. Someone had cared enough to keep something real, something tangible, through 50 years of uncertainty. Someone had made a promise to a person they'd flown with and kept that promise even when the person couldn't know about it. Even when keeping the promise meant carrying a burden alone. Even when it would have been easier to let it go. Michael asked if he could see the mask. Could he come to the hospital? Could he see the man who'd held on to his father's memory like it was the most important thing in the world? Caroline said yes. She gave him the hospital address. She gave him the visiting hours. She told him to come as soon as he could. Rick slept that night, and for the first time in 56 years, he didn't wake up in the middle of the night in a panic about whether he'd done enough, whether he'd remembered correctly, whether anyone would ever know. Rick woke up the next morning to find a man he'd never met, sitting in the chair next to his bed. Michael was older, late 50s, with gray in his hair and his father's jawline visible in his face. He looked like he hadn't slept, like he'd driven through the night, like he'd spent the entire time wondering what he was going to say when he sat down next to a man he'd never met, but whose actions had shaped his understanding of grief and memory and duty. He was holding the oxygen mask carefully, the way you might hold something precious. His hands were shaking slightly. "I don't know how to thank you," Michael said. His voice was careful, measured, like he was reading from a script he'd written and rewritten 100 times during the drive. "I don't know what the right words are. Nobody teaches you how to thank someone for carrying your father's memory." Rick couldn't speak at first. He just looked at this man, who was the embodiment of a promise he thought was broken. This was what 56 years of waiting looked like. This was what hope felt like when it finally arrived. This was James's son. This was the 3-year-old boy whose photograph James had carried, grown up, sitting in a hospital room, holding his father's oxygen mask. "Your father was an excellent pilot," Rick said finally. "In war, you can't think about anything. In war, you can't think about anything except the mission. You compartmentalize, you focus. Your brain has to shut down everything that isn't tactical, everything that isn't essential to keeping the aircraft in the air and getting you back." But he thought about you. He thought about you constantly. I remember him talking about it. He had a picture. He showed everyone. He'd pull it out and he'd say your name, and he'd talk about what you'd do when he came home. He wasn't supposed to be thinking about that. In combat, that kind of thinking gets you killed. But he did it anyway. That's who your father was. That's who he is in my memory. That's the man I've been carrying. He talked about me. Michael asked. His voice was very small. He talked about you constantly, Rick said. He had a picture. He showed everyone who'd listen. He showed me probably 100 times. This is my son, he'd say. This is Michael. Like you were the most important thing in the world, like nothing else mattered. Michael looked down at the mask in his hands. The metal caught the morning light coming through the hospital window. Outside, the city was waking up. Cars passing on the street below. People going about their lives, not knowing that inside this room, a promise was being kept. I want to ask you why, Michael said. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you try to contact us? Why did you carry this alone for 56 years? I tried, Rick said. I tried for years. I went looking for your family in 1978. I tried again in 1995. And then I couldn't find you. And then time passed. And then holding on to this became the only way I knew to prove that I hadn't let him disappear. That he'd been real. That he'd mattered. That someone beside his wife and his family had cared enough to remember. He was real, Michael said. And you know what? I grew up knowing he was real because of my mother and my uncles and my grandmother. But do you know what I never understood until right now? I never understood what it felt like to people like you. I knew he mattered to us. I'm only just now understanding that he mattered so much to someone else that you carried a piece of him across 50 years. That you made a promise to a person you thought wouldn't come home, and you kept that promise anyway. That's... Michael couldn't finish. His voice broke. He was a retired marine engineer, a practical man, a man who worked with steel and concrete and mathematical certainties. But he was crying in a hospital room because someone had cared enough to carry a piece of his father through 56 years of not knowing if anyone else remembered. Diane, who was checking on other patients but had positioned herself where she could see into Rick's room, partly because it was good nursing practice, partly because she needed to witness this, felt something shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. That's what witnessing does sometimes. It changes the weight of air. It makes grief smaller and larger simultaneously. It transforms a private burden into a shared acknowledgement. Over the next few days, more people came. Michael brought his family. He brought his wife, Patricia, who'd married him knowing his father was a ghost in their marriage, a presence that shaped everything without ever being fully present. He brought his daughter, Emma, who was almost the same age as Caroline. He brought his grandchildren, who had great-grandfather stories that began with a man who came back from war changed, who lived a full life, who had grandchildren he taught to identify aircraft types by their engine sound, the way his own father had taught him, the way one generation passes forward the small inheritances of love. They passed the oxygen mask around carefully, like it was a sacred thing, which it was. It was a prayer. It was a promise kept. It was the answer to a question that had been asked without words for 56 years. Rick improved slightly. The pneumonia didn't resolve. He was still an elderly man with serious health challenges, with lungs that had carried thousands of hours of pressurized air, with a body that had acclimated to the thin atmosphere of high altitude and now struggled with the simple mechanics of breathing at ground level. But something in him had changed fundamentally. He stopped gripping the mask with the desperate intensity of someone holding on to the last piece of his own survival. It was still his to hold. But the grip changed to something gentler, something that could be released without falling apart. Diane asked him about it one morning when she was doing his vitals. She checked his oxygen saturation, his heart rate, his blood pressure. Everything was slightly better than it had been before Michael's arrival. A nurse learns to read the body's truth. The body had been waiting for permission to heal. Permission had arrived in the form of a 52-year-old man who looked like his father. "I was holding on to it wrong," Rick said. "I was holding on to it like it was the last thing keeping me here. Like if I let it go, I would disappear. But it wasn't. It was something I was supposed to give. I just didn't know how. I didn't know who to give it to. I didn't know if anyone would understand." "Do you know how now?" Diane asked. "I'm still figuring that out," Rick said. "But I'm starting to understand that some promises don't end with a person. They end when the world knows, when people understand, when the debt is paid, when someone can look at you and say, 'I know what you did. I know why you did it. I know my father mattered because you cared enough to remember.' Here's what I want you to understand, because this is the part that my brother also taught me during his service. There are people who serve, and their service creates an invisible architecture between them and other people. Sometimes those connections are obvious. A soldier protecting his unit. Sometimes they're invisible. A pilot remembering a fallen comrade 50 years later and carrying a piece of them without ever being asked to, without anyone knowing. My brother told me that carrying someone isn't weakness. It's infrastructure. It's the thing that holds civilization together when everything else is falling apart. It's how we know that our lives matter. It's how we know that we won't be forgotten. Rick's pneumonia got worse before it got better. That's how respiratory infections work, especially in elderly patients. The antibiotics kill the bacteria, but the inflammation remains. The lungs have to relearn how to function. The hospital records would show that he had 3 separate respiratory crises over the next week. That twice they almost had to put him on a ventilator. That there were moments when his oxygen saturation dropped to dangerous levels and the alarm sounded and Diane and other staff had to come running. But he had a reason to stay alive now. Michael came to visit every day. Caroline started talking about getting him home care, about bringing him to visit Michael's house when he was strong enough. They talked about how James's mask needed to go somewhere that honored his memory. A military museum, perhaps, or a veterans center. The invisible architecture of his promise started to rebuild itself into something functional, something that meant he had a future worth returning to, something that meant his life could continue beyond the moment of rescue. He was in the hospital for 28 days total. By the end, he could walk from his bed to the window without stopping to catch his breath. His oxygen saturation held steady at 92%. His fever had broken, his blood pressure had stabilized, his body had decided to keep going. When he was discharged, the plastic oxygen mask that the hospital had provided went back to the hospital, stored in a bin with other used equipment. The military oxygen mask, James Mitchell's oxygen mask, went home with him in a protective box that Michael had brought. A custom-made wooden box with a brass nameplate that read, "In honor of First Lieutenant James Mitchell, USAF, 1938 to 2009. Carried by Rick Daniels, 1972 to 2028. Michael came to pick him up in his car, his wife Patricia beside him in the front seat. Caroline rode in the back seat next to Rick, holding the protective box. And Diane watched from the window of the hospital on the 4th floor as an elderly Air Force pilot walked out into the afternoon light, holding his daughter's hand, escorted by a family that should have been separated by war and time and the simple accident of not knowing each other until a nurse with good instincts decided to ask about a mask. Michael's arm was around Rick's shoulder, steady and strong. The oxygen mask was tucked carefully in the protective box, no longer wrapped in cloth, no longer hidden, no longer a secret. The debt was paid. But the story, surprisingly, didn't end. What I want you to understand about this story, what I need you to understand, is that this is what happens when people notice. This is what happens when a nurse who's trained to see details actually looks at what doesn't make sense. This is what happens when you refuse to believe that people's behavior is random or meaningless. Rick had been holding that mask every single day for 56 years. Before this hospital stay, he lived alone, and he held it. When his health declined, he held it. When he was admitted to the hospital, he held it so tightly that a doctor might have labeled it anxiety and prescribed medication to make him let go. But it wasn't anxiety. It was duty. It was love. It was the architecture of promises. Diane's decision to ask about the mask, to call Caroline, to allow that conversation to happen, that wasn't just good nursing. That was the recognition that people aren't collections of symptoms. They're collections of reasons. They're carrying stories. They're holding on to pieces of other people and trying to keep them alive in their memory. When my brother came back from his second deployment, he had this look in his eyes that took years to soften. I asked him once if he had regrets, and he said no, but he had moments. Moments where he carried people who didn't come back. And he said the only way to make sense of carrying them was to make sure that someone, somewhere, knew that they mattered. That's what Rick was doing. That's what the mask was doing. That's what the mask continues to do. And the call to action here, the thing I need you to understand, is that we're all walking around next to people who are carrying things. We see it as behavioral problems or anxiety or difficulty adjusting. We see it as medical symptoms that need to be medicated or managed. We see it as stubbornness or obsession or attachment to the past. But sometimes it's just someone who's keeping a promise. Pay attention. Look for the mask. Notice the things people hold on to. Ask about them. Because there's someone on the other side of someone else's burden, and they're waiting to know that their person mattered, that their person was real, that their person was remembered. Rick's names were Rick Daniels. His wingman was James Mitchell. The nurse was Diane. The daughter was Caroline. The son who came back from war was James Mitchell. The grandson who came to find a man 56 years later was Michael. And the oxygen mask, that belonged to everyone who understood that some things are too important to let go of, even when holding on costs 50 years of your life. The hospital discharged Rick on a Thursday. He lived for another 18 months. During that time, he visited Michael every other week. He attended Michael's daughter Emma's wedding. He taught Michael's grandchildren how to identify aircraft types by their engine sound, the way his father had taught him, the way one generation passes forward not just memories, but the specific way those memories live in the body, in the ear trained to recognize the particular frequency of a fighter jet climbing into the sky. He and Caroline grew closer. She brought her grandchildren to visit. She helped him organize his life so that he could spend more time with Michael's family. She learned the story of James Mitchell, and she made sure her own children knew it. She made sure it didn't disappear again. When Rick died, Michael was in the room. Caroline was in the room. Patricia and Emma and the grandchildren had left an hour before, having said their goodbyes. Michael was holding Rick's hand. Caroline was holding the other one. And the oxygen mask, James Mitchell's oxygen mask, was in a military museum now, a regional museum that tells the stories of pilots who came back and pilots who didn't, and the invisible promises that connected them across decades. The display case was on the main floor, under warm lighting. The display card read, Military Oxygen Mask, 1972. Carried by pilot Rick Daniels for 56 years in honor of fellow aviator First Lieutenant James Mitchell, who was shot down in combat and captured by enemy forces. Mitchell returned home in 1973 and lived until 2009. The discovery of this artifact reunited two families, separated by time, and kept alive the memory of service and sacrifice. Michael visited the museum once a month, just to stand in front of that display case and remember. His grandchildren grew up knowing the story. His great-grandchildren would learn it. That's the beginning and end of this story. That's what happens when someone notices. That's what happens when you choose to ask the question instead of assume the answer. The remarkable thing about Rick's story is that it almost didn't get told. That mask could have disappeared. Michael could have never known his father's oxygen mask existed. James Mitchell could have remained a historical footnote in his son's life instead of becoming the focal point of understanding what it means to be remembered. If Diane hadn't looked. If she'd accepted the standard answer. If she'd told Rick that hospital protocol meant he had to use the proper equipment. If she'd treated his behavior as a behavioral problem requiring medication rather than as a communication about something that mattered. But she didn't do any of those things. She looked, she asked, she called his daughter. She created the space for a story to be told and a promise to finally be kept. This is how the invisible architecture holds together. Person by person, moment by moment. One nurse asking the right question at the right time. Rick never did fully recover from his pneumonia, though he lived longer and with better quality of life than the initial prognosis suggested. The human body responds to meaning, to purpose, to the knowledge that your life matters to someone else. Rick's body understood that Michael existed now, that there was a reason to keep breathing, that his presence in the world meant something. In those 18 months after discharge, Rick attended family gatherings. He celebrated Michael's grandchildren's birthdays. He stood in front of the museum display and watched people stop and read the card and understand the invisible architecture that connects people across time. Some of them cried. Some of them smiled. All of them understood that this was a story about more than two pilots. It was a story about keeping someone alive in memory. It was a story about the obligations we carry. It was a story about what it means to be human in a world that tries very hard to make us forget what matters. Hold on to that. Keep that close. And the next time you see someone gripping something that doesn't make sense, stop and ask. You might be standing at the moment when someone's 50-year promise finally gets delivered.